Thank you for taking 15 minutes to watch this video. This is an important video to me because this kind of captures my dissertation topic in the context of how important it is to move public administration more towards a multidisciplinary field of study. And I hope I make my argument clear. My dissertation topic was about the power and the illegitimate leader. My focus was on social equity activists. And there's a long story as to why I chose to call them social equity activists instead of social entrepreneurs, and you'll have to read the dissertation for that. But the idea of providing them with the tools necessary and also providing them with the support of public administration as a scholarly field has been very important to me throughout my doctoral program here. I follow Susan Gooden in her thinking. In her new book this year, just out in 2014, she talks about new public administration, and I'm with her on returning to a look at a new public administration and making it a priority as something where we lost sight of our important ideals when we moved away from new public administration. New public administration, as written by Shafritz and Russell, was an academic advocacy movement, and we need to get back to that point. We need to recognize that what they talked about at the Middlebrook I conference in 1968 decided and defined very, very clearly the core of what public administration should be about. And so there's lots of scholars that talk about how we need to get back to those ideals. I'm not alone, Susan Gooden is not alone. There's many of us out there who would do that. My dissertation created, by the end of its 300 pages, an inductive sequence where it went through 6 hypotheses that define an ecological view. But what it did also, by the time I got through all 6 of my hypotheses in these 30 individual modules, is I found that I had gone way outside of the field of public administration. And some may say that, oh, I strayed off the tried and proven track, but what I think I have done is I think I have highlighted the reasons why public administration has been on a detour for the last 40 years. Because public administration has not included all of these other academic fields, and we haven't made an attempt to reach across and embrace their ideals as they relate to what we need to do in the education of students studying public administration. So this is kind of where my problem came from, is the fact that I had identified all of these other areas within public administration where we touch on other scholarly fields. In one of my papers as a graduate student, I defined what I thought were eras in public administration, or eras in governance. Let's call it eras in governance. And I think what I discovered when I was trying to balance things between liberty and equality, as John Rawls would have done, I think what I uncovered were many structural dynamics that we have failed to recognize. We've recognized them, but we haven't recognized them as something that public administration should have dealt with way earlier than we did. So that's what I'm trying to get back to. But how do we look at those structural dynamics? Do we look at them from a philosophy perspective? After all, I did the chart as a Rawlsian equilibrium, and he was a philosopher. Do we look at him as a historian would look at him, as John Lewis Gaddis did? John Lewis Gaddis would have called this an ecological view in his ideal perspective for studying history. So do we need to mix our scholarly pursuits with history? Or do we take an economics perspective? Here's my chart up here, and this is Thomas Piketty's chart on inherited wealth, and here's Thomas Piketty's chart on income inequality in the United States. But look how these 3 charts come together. I was trying to pursue this Rawlsian equilibrium. My chart starts to rise when FDR was pursuing the Great Society, and it continued to rise as LBJ got into the Civil Rights era, and the war on poverty was declared. And the alternative side of that was Thomas Piketty's chart, where he showed that there was very little inherited wealth during that same period, and income inequality had that same negative trend line. So these trend lines tell us that maybe public administration needs to pay much more close attention to the structural dynamics of economics. And I argue that it's an ecology. The global ecology is something that public administration needs to be paying attention to, because a global ecology determines who is in favor and who is out of favor by regulations, and regulations as enacted by government policy. So if we in public administration are interested in social equity, we have to watch all of these ecologies. We have to look at how all of these academic fields come together to create an ecology. And public administration has to mitigate the impact that those kinds of ecologies have on the most vulnerable citizens. So how would you describe the ecology of the 1960s? Well, Joan Walsh described it as changes in the 1960s pitted Americans against one another politically in new and destructive ways, while economically everyone fell behind. And specifically and importantly, she points out, right-wing culture warriors blamed the decline on the moral shortcomings of other Americans: blacks, feminists, gays, immigrants, and union members. This is important. This is the structural dynamics that I'm talking about. This is an ecology where there is a mobilization of bias to either cast a certain population as undeserving of public goods and services, or deviant, and therefore their behavior should be suppressed and even pushed into the underground. So that kind of mobilization of bias is what I got down to in examining very, very closely, and how to overcome that, and how to make sure the public administration does not participate in that mobilization of bias. And there's the key word there. Public administration cannot be a participant in the mobilization of bias. We have to be, as New Public Administration set out in the Minnowbrook 1 conference, we have to be advocates. We have to be the barrier between the mobilization of bias and the provision of public goods and services to every citizen equally in society. So if there was no golden age, and Joan Walsh isn't alone on this, Brownstein in his book The Second Civil War talks about how there was no golden age. If there was no golden age, what does the phrase "take our country back" really mean? The phrase "take our country back" is a mobilization of bias. Every 4 years in the United States, I don't know whether some of the younger people would recognize this slogan, but this slogan, amnesty, abortion, and acid, is what was credited with Nixon winning the most resounding election victory for a president in the history of the United States, I think, in 1972. It was an ecology of bias. Every presidential election, every 4 years, creates an ecology of bias. And so this Jacksonian idea of where the administration, after a governor wins an election victory, after a president or a prime minister wins an election victory, this Jacksonian idea that the administration reflects the political leanings of the person who won the election has to end. We in public administration have to ensure that the ecology of bias that came around during the election does not permeate into the way the public goods and services are administered. The idea that we had to have a neutral public administration was finally giving way. We were nibbling away at the problem of social equity. And under the ideas of the Minnowbrook conference, Minnowbrook 1, we had the idea that, oh, okay, we're going to break open this problem of social inequity. And then we went off on this detour. And Dr. Frozman, my dissertation chair, talks about in Public Organization Review, and a symposium edition, his concluding article in that symposium edition started with the phrase, "Can we go home now?" Because we have been, and as he argues very convincingly in that entire issue of Public Organization Review, we have been on this detour. We have been trying out a proliferation of eclectic choices in public administration, many of them unsuited for organizational effectiveness, all at the expense of alternative organizational choices. We've known that we have been ineffective since 1968 in that Minnowbrook conference, and we lost track of where we should be in public administration. So how do we get back there? I argue that we need to become much more multidisciplinary within our field. And the reason I do is because there's several ideas out there that talk about global entropy, for one of them. Randall Schweller, in his new book, talked about he's a political scientist specializing in international relations, and he talks about the idea that we're now in an age of entropy, and he uses entropy as a metaphor because entropy is a law of thermodynamics, and it talks about how everything that collides into each other builds up this entropy, and molecules that collide into each other are creating energy. And if it's a closed system, then the entropy builds up and builds up and builds up until the system opens. And he's talking about how competing global ideas are now colliding with each other, and past, present, and future need to learn how to try and coexist, but we can't. And that's what Dr. Frosman talks about as well. So this collision with each other in these ideas, in this state of entropy, this is where the mobilization of bias comes from, because everybody's ideas are colliding with each other, and they are not, we're not learning how to get along. And so public administration has to be this kind of balancing force in the provision of public goods and services, so that nobody gets left out, in spite of how many collisions there are between ideas and ideologies. So what is this global entropy? Why do we need to make this global entropy a public administration problem? I argue that the problem of social equity, of not being able to create social equity in public administration, that problem exists because there is an invisible barrier that prevents us, as a scholarly field, from penetrating into the actual root and core of the problem. And I argue in my dissertation that that problem is bias. It's an institutional barrier that protects institutions that are good at and masterful at mobilizing bias. Racism is one of them, hegemony is one of them, religious fundamentalism is one of them, and my dissertation gets into detail about each one of them. And it also adds in the cultures and traditions, which are primarily behind mobilization of bias against women. And so, how could public administration adopt an ecological view in eliminating bias as a structural dynamic? And so that's what I argue about. The structural dynamics of the global protests in 2011 were that these protesters could not create a new kind of institution. Their protest narratives never really became governing narratives. They were good at disruption, but they were not good at establishing new governance. And so what structural dynamics prevented that from happening? In 951 cities in 82 countries on one weekend, November 11th and 12th. So it was an enormous movement that had no institutional foundation to actually give it sustainability, and that's what I argue we need to create. Also, on the inner cities all over the world, the participant observation study that I did on the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Liberty City, which is a neighborhood of Miami. And what I found was that there were tons and tons of structural dynamics in a city that has, many of them could be traced to the nature of Liberty City being a historically segregated city. It was founded on the ideas of segregation, Jim Crow laws. So this is where I go to in my research. I argue for, on my fifth hypothesis in the inductive sequence, I argue for the training of individuals who I call jugglers, because they have to be really, really good at 6 important multidisciplinary tasks. And this is really where my argument for multidisciplinarity comes in for public administration, is the training of these transformational leaders. And so then I get into my 2 research questions. One focuses on the inner city, which are I characterize as the population that has been cast as undeserving in the mobilization of bias. And I also focus on how functional and effective at policy change a PFLAG group can be in a suburban Utah neighborhood. PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And this is a population that is traditionally cast as deviant through the mobilization of bias. So these 2 populations are who I look at in my dissertation. And I look at how current structures of governance in the United States in particular are ineffective because they create 6 silos. We have the federal government, the state government, the county government, the city government, the school district, and we have nonprofit organizations, all trying to do the same thing, but we have no connectivity here at the street level, bureaucrat level. So this is the inner city situation. And we also have to recognize that on my diagram, policy making, which is at the bottom, and administration, which is at the top, are really connected with each other. So we think of this flat sheet as a tube that is rolled together where policy making and administration flow through each other. So the power of the individuals in this middle layer are where I take an ecological view. What kind of an ecology do we have? For research question number 1, it is looking at an inner city situation. For research question number 2, it's looking at an activist situation. What tools can we give activists and volunteers who are out there defending a vulnerable population so that they're more effective, and what can we give them so that they can alter the ecology. Because what we're after here is transformational change. This is my sixth hypothesis. And we're after transformational change, and the only way we're going to get it is if we have more power down here among the street level bureaucrats, community organizers, and social equity activists. So I argue that we have the capability in public administration of creating an institution that would change the ecology at this level and unify this block of individuals who are right at the point where products and services, public goods and services, are delivered to citizens and society equally. And that's how we can change that, is if we can change this ecology. And so what I have proposed in my dissertation is this idea of creating a non-hierarchical organizing unit for each one of these communities, such as the PFLAG group in a suburban Utah neighborhood, and for all of the community workers and street-level bureaucrats in the inner city, such as Miami's Liberty City area. So this is where I want to create this new ecology, and this is how I want to go about, and how I argue that we can go about creating such a new ecology without reliance upon hierarchical institutions. And if we have these units here who are well organized and claim their legitimacy, then what we have actually done is we have been successful at transferring the power and devolving the power down from the hierarchies of elected officials to the actual community level. And this can be done on a global level. The institution that I argue should be created works by stacking these organizational units within each other so that there's areas of specialization but no hierarchy. But how do you teach this kind of collective governance? This is a completely new way of seeing communitarianism, because it functions as collectives without a hierarchy, and it works on consensus building rather than top-down decision making. And so that is the multidisciplinary nature of public administration that I see possible. And I see it as something that works within new public administration's framework. We don't need to create a new kind of public administration. We just have to return to new public administration and build this kind of ecology into it. Because the goals were already there, the mechanisms were already there, the ideals were already there. We just need to pull that away from hierarchical organizations, which is probably what they intended in the first place, even in 1968, and give it to this collective kind of administration, and remain true and fast to new public administration ideals. And the way I propose teaching this is the same way that B.F. Skinner taught his ideas through Walden 2. Walden 2 was an amazing novel. This is a diagram which I found on the internet that somebody actually put together an organizational chart of how Walden 2 was put together. This is that kind of educational tool. So if I were, and my ideal is for the future here is to write a fictional account of some future novel, a future fiction, where I can outline the ideals of collective governance as though it's already in place. And that's the goal which I have for my next book now that the dissertation is behind me. Thank you for watching the video, and I look forward to any ideas and feedback which you may want to offer to me. Thanks so much.